thought, let's just start with looking at why did we decide to look at frustration today. So you will be able to find a lot of research done on frustration at work, and I just wanted to share one specific study with you guys. So at the bottom of the slide, you'll be able to see the title of this article that was published, and it was published in the Pan-African Journal of Business Management. So excuse me guys, I am trying to multitask and I remember that I'm not recording myself, so please bear with me. I'm just quickly going to put on the recording.
Don't worry, Elna, I'm recording for you.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. Good, so no more interruptions. Okay, so the research was there to examine frustration at work and to try to see what is the implication on employee performance based on certain workplace frustrations. So frustrations at work negatively affected the performance of employees. So I think this is something that's quite easy to assume it will happen, but it is also good to see that it is backed through research that whenever we do experience workplace frustration, it will actually decrease our performance. So what was more interesting for me was to discover that developmental experiences of employees actually positively moderated the negative relationships between workplace frustration and employee performance. So this was quite interesting to see that the moment you invest in the development of your employees and they feel they have growth opportunities within the environment, the effect of frustration on their performance was actually not as big. So it doesn't say that the frustrations was eliminated completely, but it does indicate that the way they responded was different, and in essence the performance wasn't effective as much. Then similarly, the negative relationship between workplace frustration and employee performance was then also moderated by team support. So things there were good relationships, there were positive relationships in the organization. So this was quite interesting for me to see that we actually can have an effect on the frustrations we feel in the workplace and our employees feel if we are managers. So what we try to need to focus on during the session is to see what we can learn from our own behavioral preferences and personality traits to support ourselves, but then to also support our teams a little bit better. So Dr. Steve Maraboli said, expectation feeds frustration. So basically, it is an unhealthy attachment to people, to things, and to outcomes we wish we could control, but don't. So in other words, we need to first understand our expectations before we will be able to manage our frustrations. And our behavioral preferences and our personality traits will give us some clues as to what our typical expectations may be. So look out for those ones as we go through today's session. So in last week's session, Candace did share this slide to you to explain what are our personality and what are our behavior. So just a very brief recap. If we look at the iceberg there, the top of the iceberg will be our observable behavior. In other words, that's the things that people see. It's easy for people to identify behaviors of one another, and those are also the things that we typically measure with our PPA assessment. Then we have a personality, so that would be all the things that's beneath the surface. So our personality, our beliefs, our values, our attitudes, that essentially informs our behavior. Those are the personality traits we can understand better by doing the TQ assessment and trying to understand those traits. So I want you to take just a moment and think of what are the greatest challenges you currently face. So as we talk through the slides, maybe just have a pen and paper close and write down whenever you are reminded of specific challenges during a time like this. So that might just help you to, as we go through the content, to try to link the challenges that you wrote down or that you're thinking about to specific behavioral styles or personality traits that you have. Okay, so let's look at what is frustration. So in psychology, frustration is a common emotional response to opposition. It is related to anger, to annoyance, or to disappointment. And frustration normally arises from the perceived resistance to the fulfillment of an individual's will or goal, and is likely to increase when a will or goal is denied or blocked. So think of the previous quote we looked at. It's whenever we can't control something. So we have a will, we have a goal, we want to control our own will and our own goal, but it isn't always possible. So we all go through life with our own personal set of ideas about how we think things should work out, how we think people should treat us, and also how we think other people should behave. So I like to refer to this personal sense we all have of how the world should operate as our personal rule book. So your rule book, once again, then incorporates your beliefs, your perspectives, your values, which are the things that we're going to look at in terms of our personality traits. So in essence, the most frustrations in life, no matter what the situation, have at their core one simple thought: it shouldn't be this way. Okay. So what should we do with frustration? These are 3 simple steps that I would like to share with you. And I thought to share it in the beginning before we actually look at the triggers, because I want you guys to start thinking about this. What do you do normally when you feel frustrated, and what can you perhaps do differently? So if we look at step 1, it simply states that you need to start by recognizing that if you are feeling frustrated by a situation, it is likely because something isn't going the way you think it should. So identify what it is you believe should be happening. So usually it takes us quite quickly to get to step 1. I mean, we typically very easily feel the frustration or identify the frustration. But what we then do is most of us stop at this step. In other words, we keep our focus on situations that isn't going the way we want it to go. We keep on thinking and also talking about the situations. But what we really should do is stop talking about whatever is frustrating you and move on to step 2 and to step 3. So in step 2, we see that we need to identify what it is you would prefer to be different. Okay, so rather than focusing on what isn't going your way, if you could control it, what do you want to be different? And then thinking about what you want instead of what is bothering you, puts you in a place for the next point, which is move from reacting. So remember, frustration is an emotional reaction, to generating a solution that will reduce your frustration and improve how you feel. Okay, so if only this was as easy in real life as it sounds on paper, then none of us would probably have experienced frustrations. But let's look at typical triggers of frustration and help you guys to identify the root of your frustration to ultimately help you to better manage your frustration. Very important to remember that to get an effective solution, you always need to remember that you control what you can control and what you can't control. So you have the ability to control your thoughts and your actions. And this is something we very often forget. We think there's a certain thought and it's there and I can't control it. I can't get the thought out of my head because if it's there, it's there. But you can actually control your thoughts and your actions. So you don't control the rules other people live by, or how they choose to express their own thoughts and actions. So therefore, when you are trying to assess what you can do to improve a situation, your goal would be to come up with things that you can do differently. So don't focus on what other people should be doing differently. Focus on what you should be doing differently. And if you struggle with certain thoughts, just remember the saying that you can't prevent a bird from flying over your head, but you can prevent it from making a nest in your head. Okay, so the thoughts might come, but then what you do with it is up to you. So let's look at behavior and frustration. So in last week's session, Candace shared more about the different behavioral styles. These are the things that we measure with our PPA assessment. So just as a very brief recap, we assess a person's dominance or influence or steadiness or compliance. So whenever you are more of a dominant individual, you tend to be quite assertive, competitive, direct, driving, forceful. So it's all about results. How will I achieve results ultimately? Then if you are more of an influential individual, those are the ones that focus on relationships, on working with and through people, engaging people, getting people together. So they are the ones who tend to be quite communicative, friendly, influential, persuasive, positive, verbal. Okay, then we have our steadiness individuals. So for them, it's all about creating and feeling that sense of security, of stability. And they tend to be quite amiable, deliberate, dependable, methodical, thorough, and persistent. And then we have our compliant individuals. They are the ones who are very accurate, careful, compliant, logical. They might be perfectionistic. So for them, it's all about what are the rules, what are the regulations, and sticking to those type of things. So remember, most of us might have a combination of one or more of these factors. So also take into consideration how some of these traits might be enhanced through another factor or might even be moderated through another factor as well. So if you are trying to identify negative behaviors, whether it's in yourself or say, for instance, you are working with people and you're trying to gauge, what are the type of things that frustrate them, try to understand them a little bit better, these might be some clues for you to consider. So if we look at the dominant behavior, you can expect things like being impulsive, hot-tempered, demanding. They tend to point out mistakes, can be unreasonable in terms of their expectations, and in some instances, they might lack empathy. If we look at our influences, they tend to be quite impatient. They can be sarcastic. They can just give up because they are all about energy and bringing people together and being quite lively and have fun. The moment they perceive that's not an option for them, they can almost just sort of lose their energy and give up the task they are busy with. They can interrupt people, so they are the ones, if you're busy telling your story and they chip in, sharing their part of the story, that will typically be the influencer. Tend to be quite self-centered, not necessarily to be mistaken with egocentric. It's more just of they want to share how they are, what they're going through, how the job is going. They are the ones that want to talk about themselves. They often attempt to multitask, and then they can be quite dramatic in the way they share their feelings or experiences. Then we have our steadiness individuals. They also tend to be quite emotional, but more on an internal level. In other words, they won't necessarily share the emotions they experience unless it is on a one-on-one basis, and probably when they trust someone. In other words, the trusting relationship is already there. They might have difficulty making decisions. They can beat around the bush. In some cases, over-apologize or take things personally. They are the ones who might inhibit innovation because they prefer the status quo, and mistaking intensity for anger or hostility. Okay, so think if you have any of the behaviors of the dominant or influencer person and you're quite intense, or you express a demand in an intense manner, the steadiness people would be the people who probably perceive that as being as anger or even as hostile behavior. Then if we look at our compliant individuals, you can expect of them to be quite suspicious. They tend to be nitpicking perfectionists, closed off to change, disagreeable, ticking off boxes. Remember, they like rules, so they want to sort of be able to tick, I have done A, B, and C. They can get quite stuck on specifics. They can complain, and then they can also be avoidant or hostile. Okay. So let's look at specific things that frustrates each profile. So there are things that in general will frustrate all of us based on our different profiles. So what we need to take into consideration during a time like this, that we all have this underlying frustration because we are in lockdown, because we are working remotely. There's so many things we don't have control over, and we said in the beginning that lack of control is usually the thing that leads to frustration. So remember that we all now sit with that sort of inherent frustration. So any of these things might now just be elevated or be enhanced during a time like lockdown. In other words, it might be even more difficult to manage the frustration, and it's much more important to be aware of these things in order to manage it. So if we look at a dominant person, they in their need wants to control things more than other people. So having a lack of control is extremely frustrating. Unclear goals, a lack of options. They typically are quite decisive, so they want options. Repetition will frustrate them, irrelevance will frustrate them, waiting, and a lack of results. So remember, for them, it's all about achieving specific results. If we look at our influences, routine tasks tend to frustrate them, being stuck at a desk. So think of remote working now, they are stuck inside their houses. How is that affecting them? Imposed structure, unable to express themselves. Remember, they like to talk, they like to share about themselves. Inflexibility, and also waiting. Then we have the steadiness, frustrated whenever you break a promise. So try to be quite careful when you work with these individuals, not to tell them, I will phone you tomorrow afternoon, and then never phone them without an explanation why you didn't. Insincerity, isolation. So again, think of the effect of remote working, change in general, unresolved conflict, a lack of support, and also constant interruptions. In other words, if they plan to do something and they can't get to those tasks, that constant interruption causes quite a great deal of frustration. And then if we look at the compliance, what will frustrate them would be haphazard attitudes, poorly defined responsibility. So remember, for them, they want to know, what is my responsibility? What do I need to do? What are the boxes I need to tick? So whenever they're not clear on their own responsibility, that causes frustration, disorganization, inconsistency, a lack of control as well, although they control through following standard operating procedures, rules, and regulations, but they still want that level of control. And then irresponsibility of others. Okay, so I hope at this stage you can already link some of these behaviors to your own profile and to some of your own frustrations, but also to your team members and people you work with. So let's look at some tools for changing our behavior. I want you to just take a moment to think, can anyone make you feel a certain way? So the way you feel, does anyone else have control over that? And the answer is no. So this is a very important aspect for us to know, once again, that we choose how we feel. We choose do we react good? Do we react bad? So if we want to change our behaviors, we need to choose to change it. Okay, so the first step will be to help yourself identify your triggers, as I said. So think of things like, is it a lack of productivity during meetings while working remotely that really gets to me? Or is it that others are not listening to me or to the other employees? Is it that you feel you don't receive clear guidelines on your expectations? So yes, you're at home, but what does it mean? What's my hours of working? And then not enough flexibility or movability, so able to just go out and about, or not knowing the end goal, or a lack of attention or support. So let's look at keys to manage frustration with high dominant people. So once again, they prefer tangible, measurable, and achievable results. So now what you need to do, whether it's for yourself, so in order to develop your own or to manage your own frustrations, or from a point of view that you are a manager and you need to manage a person with high dominance, you need to ask yourself, how can you adjust your goals to create regular short-term goals? So as I mentioned earlier, we are all aware of the fact that there's so many things surrounding our current circumstances that we can't manage, we can't control, we don't have any decision-making authority over so many things that's happening. So what are the goals that we can actually put in place? How can we have short-term goals from weekly to monthly goals that we can work towards in order to still feel that we are accomplishing goals, even though there's many things we don't have control over? So the high dominance people then also really like challenging assignments and problems to solve. So you want to ask yourself how you can keep yourself and your team challenged while business as usual is not happening. So if you know there's a specific issue the company is currently struggling with, give that issue to your high dominant person. Ask them to try and come up with a solution or to maybe present on some options of solutions. So give them those tasks. It will engage them, it will make them feel valuable, and it will make them feel they can still accomplish some things, even though there's certain things they can't accomplish. Then they really want to know the why behind any decision or any conversation they have with other people, and they really prefer receiving direct answers. So if you, for instance, are the person with high dominance and you feel that you don't always understand the why of a decision, why a decision was made, have you tried to ask for that? So are you just giving up and feeling frustrated because you feel you don't get all the answers and you don't understand why certain decisions are being made? Or are you actually going out and trying to find out what are the reasons for decisions and seeking out the direct answers? So as a manager, also be aware that if you work with high dominant people and you need to convey messages or decisions over to them, make sure you answer the why question and be direct in your answers as well. Then for them, we mentioned that it's all about productivity and efficiency. So ask the question, how can I ensure efficiency is maintained while working remotely? So say, for instance, if the workload isn't the same as it always was, or certain responsibilities you will usually have, you don't have currently, then try to, again, create that short-term goals for yourself. But if we break it down to more to a day-to-day basis, try to implement things like, say, for instance, I'm going to work in 2-hour segments throughout the day. And for each of the 2 hours, I'm going to set a specific goal or a specific result, a report I need to finish, or whatever the case is. Then for those 2 hours, you focus purposefully, you work towards that goal, you achieve the goal and feel that sense of accomplishment. Then they also preferred quite a variety of activities, which is also quite a big challenge during a time like this. So how can you create variety when at home the whole day? So ask those questions, brainstorm with your team, and think of things like I said, if you work in 2-hour segments, what can you then do as a break? So say you take a 15 or a 20 or a 30-minute break between your 2 hours. Do something completely different from your work. So do something interesting, build a puzzle, read a book, do something that's going to take your mind completely off of your work. And then when you come back for the next 2 hours, you then purposely focus again. In that way, you create a sense of variety throughout your day that will help you manage some of the frustrations. Good. So if we look at keys to manage frustration with high influence, we need to remember, first of all, for them, it's all about positive attention. So ask yourself the question, have you checked in on them and pay attention to what they are busy with? So in other words, if you are managing the influencer, you need to know these are the activities I have set out for this week. They want to know that you are interested in what they do. Give ample opportunity for them to express themselves. So do you have a platform where they can express themselves? In other words, if you have your team meetings, do you give opportunity for the team to share how they are doing, or to share highs and lows of a week, things like that? Then they are the ones who also really like group activities outside of work. So they want to connect with their colleagues, but more on a personal level as well. And I know as I'm saying this, some of the high S's and high C's immediately think, please, this is the last thing I want to do. I don't want additional interaction with my colleagues, and that's 100%. The point is to have a little bit more room and grace for one another, to know who are the colleagues that really want a bit of a chat outside of the work as well, and try to provide that to them as far as possible. So do you have any virtual socials where you do not discuss anything work related? Say, for instance, having a virtual lunch hour once a week or once every 2 weeks, having virtual drinks a Friday after work, things like that. Then freedom from control and detail. So whenever you have to check in with them as a manager managing high eyes, do you make them feel controlled? In other words, do you make them feel that it's just, I'm checking up where your work is? Or do you actually engage them in the discussion, try to understand where they're at, if they're struggling with something, why is it that they're struggling? And then also when you talk to them, are there detail that can be eliminated? So this is quite important. If you have to call your high influencer friend, first of all, you have to first have a chat about how things are going. But then if you are a very detailed orientated individual, try not to impose all that detail and all that structure onto them over a phone. They're probably going to lose you after the second and then they're not going to engage or actually be able to participate in that. So first sort out your own thoughts and maybe just give a summary of what is most important when you do call them, as opposed to discussing everything in a lot of detail. And then show enthusiasm for what they are working on. So do you give and ask them for regular feedback? You give them the opportunity to share their achievements and how their work are going. Okay. So keys to manage frustration with high steadiness. So remember, when we talk about the high steadiness, for them, it is all about the status quo, about the security of a situation, about known territory and historical procedures. So we are in a quite challenging time in the sense of there isn't a lot of security. There might be a lot of things going on that's not known territory or historical procedures. So what can you do to set them at ease? Are you giving them regular feedback? So feedback on how is the business doing? How's the team doing? Set them at ease. So even when it is negative, information, rather share it with them, then they can prepare, then they can adjust to it, as opposed to keeping it away from them and then causing a lot more frustration through that lack of security. And wherever possible, focus on what is known or historical procedures. So keep certain things in place that you can keep in place. Do things in the same way wherever possible. Also be very aware that they take time and they need time to adjust to change. So if you are someone who welcomes change, ask yourself the question, are you pushing these people to change without giving them proper guidance and security? So yes, we can't get away from change. It is inevitable. We are in a situation that's quite difficult. So it's all about then how do you guide them through the change? How do you provide security, answer the questions they might have, as opposed to just pushing the change onto them. Then encourage them to speak up, but also give them time to consider how they want to present their point of view. So remember, they won't necessarily be the ones who just speak up, especially in a group or a big group. So you need to encourage them to get them to speak in terms of how it's going, what they are struggling with, what support they might need. But in most instances, you would need to give them some time to consider how they want to present their viewpoint. So something that works very well is to maybe have discussion points or things you want to know, send it in advance, give them time to prepare, which might make them feel a little bit more comfortable to share their points of view and where they're at currently. Remember with them, one-on-one support and appreciation is extremely important for the same reason as they don't usually speak up in a group. You need to have that regular one-on-one check-ins, and not only to provide them with support, but also to show your appreciation for what they are doing and the things they are coping with well and those type of things. And then be aware of just interrupting them. So are you booking meetings and discussions with them well in advance? So there might definitely be certain elements of the steadiness as well as compliant people who might actually like working from home because it is less interruptions than what they find in the office. So there might be a lot of positive things as well. But remember, whenever you're working with a high steadiness individual, try to plan a little bit better, book your meetings, your discussions with them in advance, and it gives them plan then to organize, time to organize, and you don't interrupt what they are busy with. Good, so we're moving on to high compliance. Okay, so I did speak about responsibility and compliant people who always want to know what are their responsibility within any given situation. So be very clear about your expectations. Are you completely certain that all your employees are clear about their responsibilities while working remotely? So if there's expectations of you need to work 10 hours a day, you're not allowed to take a lunch break, or you're not allowed to take a coffee break, or you can take 3 coffee breaks, whatever that might look like for your own company, be sure they know the expectations. Otherwise, they're going to put a lot of pressure on themselves. And that's also the reason for the next step, encourage boundaries. So are they being encouraged to actually take breaks, to switch off at the end of the day? So something that's quite difficult to manage is your workplace and your home is the same thing now. So when do you stop working and when do you start just relaxing at the end of the day? So those are type of things that, especially with the high compliant people, because they don't want to break a rule, they want to stay on track, they might need a little bit extra encouragement to say, you can take that lunch break and that tea breaks, you can play with your kids for an hour during the day. Then also provide them with reassurance. So do you have regular check-ins to provide them with reassurance that their work is on track? They want to know, I am doing what you're expecting of me, I am still on the right track. So give them that assurance. and then authorized and agreed changes. So for them, the whole concept of change needs to go along with structure, time to explain. They need to agree upon the changes before you just implement the changes. So give them the opportunity to discuss the pros and the cons, to ask all their detailed questions before you expect them to just implement change. And then help them ask for help. Okay, so again, it's all about them taking responsibility. They want to follow rules, and they don't want to come across as weak when they ask for help. So sometimes you need to encourage them to ask for help without questioning their competence. So in a safe way, make sure that if they are struggling in this stance, try to encourage them to speak up, to say where they can actually be helped, and then reach out to them in that way as well. So, very important aspect, remember, when we're talking about these changes and being aware of our own behavior and being aware of other people's behavior, we need to take into consideration that your attitude will ultimately determine everything that happens around you. So it's your attitude, and your attitude, as we saw in the beginning, forms part of your personality. It's your attitude that controls your behavior. So what we often do is we think we can't change our behavior because it is often a preset behavior that became a habit, and a habit are hard to break. But still, behavior breeds behavior. So the more you focus on adjusting your behavior, the more you will find it naturally to not react to certain things or get frustrated about certain things that you would normally do. So always remember that we choose our behavior. No one can make you feel a certain way. No one can make you act in a certain way. And you are the one that use your behavior to either be positive or to be negative. So you choose, am I going to help myself? Am I going to help others, persuade others, collaborate with others? Or am I just going to hinder myself and others, obstruct, resist, be negative about all the change I am experiencing currently? So challenge yourself. What is your attitude? What are the things that you can actually change that maybe you've been thinking for the past 7 weeks you don't have control over it, but actually in reality you do have control because it is your attitude. Good, so we're moving over to personality and frustration. So just a very quick recap again. We look at emotional intelligence, so balancing logic and emotion, and also balancing your head versus your heart. So when do you need to think logic, but where do you need to be in touch of your emotions? So our trait emotional intelligence questionnaire is a personality trait-based questionnaire. So there's 5 specific personality traits that we measure with 4 emotional factors and 1 overall score. And remember, the scores you see there are percentile scores. So it places you in a position against the working population of South Africa. So if you look at the next slide, we see based on the different scores, you either score same as most other people, or less than most other people, or more than most other people. And just to clarify, if there's maybe any uncertainty, say for instance, my empathy is less than most other people, there's a specific definition attached to it. In other words, I'm a quite logical individual. I don't get persuaded by emotions when I make a decision. I look at a situation quite objectively. So we need to remember there's no good or bad. It's just a different response, and it is who we are. So what I want you guys to focus on when you try to identify triggers, try to identify your own frustration, it's typically quite helpful to focus on the traits that you have that's either less than most other people, or the traits that's more than most other people. So in most instances, the frustration will come from one of those 2 scores. Okay, so let's look at some tools then to manage these personality traits of us. Okay, So just a very brief reminder, your well-being factor, overall well-being factor, consists of happiness, of optimism, and of self-esteem. So what are the typical questions you can ask yourself in order to identify triggers that frustrate you? The first one would be, are you filtering out positive information? So at certain times, people tend to focus only on negative information. So they simply sort of just overlook, or they don't even notice the positive things around them. And obviously, as we all know, that is something that typically lowers your mood and then enhance the feelings of frustration. Are you listening carefully in meetings to other people's views? So always ask for the upside of a situation and also be prepared to discuss solutions to the downsides that you will notice. So there's always going to be challenges, there's always going to be risks, there's always going to be downsides. So yes, there's a lot of downsides to working remotely while we are in lockdown, but don't focus on those ones, rather have discussions around how can you come up with certain solutions to make it better. Then are you focusing on what you can control? So we've spoken quite a bit about control. So be careful not to spend your time, your energy, or your thoughts on the things you cannot control. That's just going to enhance the frustration. And do you have unrealistically high expectations? So having unrealistic expectations of yourself or of the situation, of your company, of the government for that matter, that might lead to goals that sort of not achievable. And that again will reinforce feelings of frustration. Then say, for instance, you are naturally quite happy, focus on the positive, you tend to make the best of the situations that you are dealt with, then ask yourself the question, do you sometimes avoid less happy colleagues? So this is a part where we need to see that typically people that's the opposite from ourselves, they are the people that's going to tend to frustrate us. So if you have a very positive outlook and you deal with someone who's quite negative, then the frustration will most likely come from both sides. But then rather try to influence the person with your positive outlook than trying to avoid them. And then are you expressing happiness in an inappropriate way? So if someone is sharing something that's really sensitive and possibly quite difficult for them, then make sure when you share your positive experiences, you don't do it in an inappropriate way and breaking them down, but rather do it to lift them up. If we look at self-control, we have emotion regulation, impulse control, and stress management. So ask yourselves the question, do you mentally note early signs that you are getting emotional? So look out for things like your thoughts start to race, your heart beats faster, you struggle to focus on your work. So look out for that cues. And the moment you identify, I'm getting emotional, you can immediately jump over and start to find a solution as opposed to going down the rabbit hole of your emotion. So do you find yourself often blaming other people? So strong, uncontrolled emotions will sometimes lead the person experiencing them to blame someone who has nothing to do with it. So be very careful. Don't blame other people. Don't expect other people to change. That's not going to eliminate your frustration. It's only going to enhance it. So do you move stress from one area in your life to another? In other words, if you are experiencing a lot of frustrations in your current work environment, do you then take those frustrations and now you are negative with your spouse at home or with your kids at home? That's not the right way to deal with your emotions. Rather try to move your stress into a neutral area. So if you feel, okay, the frustration is building up, let's rather go read a book that will lift your spirit, or go and play a sport, exercise a little bit, build a puzzle if that's your thing. But again, try to set some short-term targets that you can control and then stick to them. And then do you perceive others as being aloof or insincere or cold because they control their emotions carefully? So again, the last 3 points are all about, can I put myself in someone else's shoes? So if I experience emotions to the extreme, can I try to understand where someone comes from that control their emotions well? And then rather try to share with them or try to get them to share their emotions than just assuming they are not interested or they are a cold individual. Same with something like, for instance, you have high stress management. In other words, you don't get anxious too quickly. Then how do you react to other people's anxiety? Do you have room for them to experience what they experience? Or do you immediately get frustrated with everyone that's different from you? And then, in essence, the team support, the positive relationships between the team members, then will be resulted negatively or affected negatively. Okay, and lastly, looking at some emotionality factors. So we have empathy, we have your emotion perception, your emotion expression, and relationship. So I spoke about you struggle to put yourself in someone else's shoes. So try to ask questions if you can't understand why someone is reacting the way they are reacting. Then do you tend to detach yourself from the outside world? So people who prefer not to pay attention to strong emotions, either their own emotions or the emotions of other people, they can sometimes completely detach themselves from everyday affairs. So this will lead to a lack of concern about your own feelings, and that's something that's going to build up to a point that you're going to explode, as opposed to just dealing with the emotion as it comes in. And then, do you spend too much time thinking about emotions, or do you express your emotions too eagerly? Okay, so if you find yourself and you have spend a whole day only thinking of emotions, feeling overcome with different emotions of frustration, things you can't control, then that's a good cue that you need to start moving to a solution. So it means you're not focusing on a solution, you're only focusing on the problem at hand. And then do you express that emotion? So sometimes you just need to feel the frustration, try to come up with a solution before you share it with people, to avoid making people negative about things that you are negative about. Okay. So the next time you're faced with a situation that makes you feel frustrated, try to examine your belief system. So go and look at those different traits in your TQ report and try to ask yourself, what are the beliefs that I've attached to a certain person or event or situation? So just to give you an example of how we will interpret the graph you see there, A is an activating event. So that can be anything, and it's something you don't have control over. You can't change it. But then B is your belief system. So the first thing that pops up in your head when the activating event takes place, that's B, and that's what you can change. That's your own perception about what's going on around you. And then the result will be the emotional consequence, which is C. And unless you change B, you won't be able to change C. So just to give you a quick example, say for instance you are on a bus and someone walks in, they jab you with their umbrella, you think immediately it was on purpose. So that came from some sort of belief that you can't trust people, people always try to do negative things, whatever the belief is you hold, but that belief leads you to thinking he did it on purpose. And then see the emotional consequence or the emotional reaction is that you get highly agitated. So you immediately are ready to jab him back. And then as you turn around, you see the person is actually blind. So then immediately the frustration you held disappears, and you even either feel pity for him or you feel guilt because of your own reaction to them. So whenever you experience a very negative emotional consequence, emotional reaction, try to go back to what was the belief that I attached to the event. So the moment you can challenge your own belief system, then you will be able to challenge challenge the emotional consequence of your belief system. Okay, so again, it is not easy. Managing and dealing effectively with our emotions is never easy. Modifying our behavior is not easy. So it really takes a deliberate choice to work on it, to manage it. And it's something you're going to have to do constantly. So this is not something, you won't be better at managing your frustrations tomorrow just because you listen to this session. It's something you're going to have to practice every single day, over and over, before it's actually going to change your life. So whenever you feel those feelings, go back to what are the trigger events. If I can identify that, I can identify why I'm frustrated, what shouldn't be the way according to my own view, and then how do I prefer to have it differently, and start to come up with a solution. So if you're not at a solution yet, you know you haven't managed or dealt with your frustrations effectively. The moment you start to come up with certain solutions, that's the moment you know that you actually are busy managing and dealing your emotions and your frustrations. So the final thought of the day, this was just one study, so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail as we don't have much time left, but they discussed the concept of resilience and how our everyday stresses and frustrations can help us to actually deal with the problems more effectively. And in short, the concept comes down to change how you perceive frustration. So if you see frustration as something that can teach you more about yourself, more about others, it's something that can make you resilient to different challenges in the future, then you might attach a more positive connotation to your frustrations. So the key takeaway is to modify your perception of stress and frustration in order to promote the development of resilience, and then obviously the ability to handle whatever comes your way in the most effective way. So there's also a study that said that people, it was a long-term study, and it found that people who viewed stress or frustrations in a positive light actually lived longer and healthier than those who had less stress or experienced less frustration but viewed it in a negative way. So it all comes back to challenge your beliefs and challenge your attitude. Good. We came to the end of the session. So what I am going to do now is I'm going to put my video back on. I'll have a look at the questions in the comment box, but you are also welcome to unmute yourself, to share any comment, to share any question you have, anything actually that you would like to share with a bigger group, or any question you might have. Okay, so there's one question in the comment box, and the question is, what is the best way to motivate people with the changes to help with their frustrations? When does implementing changes become too much for those who don't enjoy change upon change? And how do we influence their attitudes towards the change to be more positive? So I think the short answer would be that creating awareness. So if people understand their behavior better, if they understand their personality traits better and where it comes from, then you immediately or automatically actually help them to deal with frustrations. If they don't know where it comes from, it's very difficult to manage it. So the first step is create the awareness. That's what we usually do through assessing, through feedback, is creating that awareness. And then how do you motivate them? So we have a session on motivation. So please tune in for the session on motivation and communication, where we will look at specific ways you can help the people based again on their specific behavioral traits to feel more motivated to deal with these frustrations. But the starting point, always creating that awareness for them. Any other questions? You're welcome to pop it into the box. You're welcome to unmute yourself and ask a question or share a comment.